There's a vicious cycle that we seem to be stuck in. A disaster happens, we respond, rebuild, and repeat. And budgeting has through history focused on picking up the pieces after a disaster. Now this approach, experts warn, is a hindrance to progress towards sustainable development. And for a world that is now more than ever exposed to dramatic weather events, it is time to think risk reduction as opposed to disaster management. Hi, my name is David Owino. Welcome to the Africa Development Journal, a premier audiovisual journal of Africa's development journey. The hashtag to use is Africa Development Journal. In this episode, we focus on conversations at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction that happened in Geneva, Switzerland. And now our first story is on resilience. Take a look. Some plants would shed off their leaves ahead of a difficult season like a drought or even a cold winter. And some animals would move to new locations ahead of a difficult weather season in their usual habitations. And these are their different ways of adjusting their lives in order to cope with what we have called forces of nature. Well, disaster experts would call that resilience. Now, behind me at the Geneva International Convention Center, close to 4,000 people from all over the world are gathered to discuss just that, the safety of people and investments in the face of increasing disaster events. The Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, organized by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, is a gathering of people and institutions working in different ways to reduce deaths and economic losses from natural and man-made emergencies.
I am enormously comforted and compelled by this year's global platform. We have assembled more than 4,000 concerned and committed individuals from governments, from the fields of science, public policy and academia, from civil society and international organizations, from media to concerned citizens to debate, discuss and take clear actions for reducing disaster risk and building resilience.
The basis of all conversations here is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, a document that sets targets and priorities in reducing disaster risks and defines approaches in achieving those targets, adopted by member states in 2015 in Sendai, Japan. High in the agenda is the fifth target of the framework, requiring nations to have national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. With just a few months to go, many African nations, including Kenya, do not have national strategies defining what risks they are exposed to, the approaches to address them, and the roles of different agencies and departments in reducing the possibility of disasters happening. The global platform is a learning opportunity. As disasters and their drivers are transboundary, countries learn from each other's experience and find ways of collaborating for faster progress. Happening soon after the cyclones Idai and Kenneth hit Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe and Tanzania, it was an opportunity for the affected countries and the continent to reflect on what did and didn't work and mobilize support of the international community in building back the cities and the villages that were affected.
A lot of infrastructures were destroyed, the roads, as I said, I think we have seen it on the media, it was terrible. I understand it was the worst cyclone in the southern hemisphere, so we were all caught by surprise. There was previous information telling us that there was going to be that event, but nobody had the idea of the magnitude of the event. So that's why it caused a lot of damages.
Vous avez raison, la plateforme du
The Geneva platform arrives right on time, just a few weeks after what happened, the flooding from the Idai cyclone, followed by Kenneth. Last year, Mozambique was also hit, along with Malawi and Zimbabwe, and Kenneth hit the Comoros. That means we must accelerate the implementation of the different strategies to reduce the risks of disasters on the continent. We have learnt a lot. the most important lesson is the necessity to build up the resilience of our communities. Because without resilience against the natural disasters, it's difficult for the African continent.
The cyclones in the southern hemisphere provide context that, driven by a global climate crisis, such extreme weather events are now a reality that Africa will have to contend with. Countries and organizations discussed progress made over the past 2 years in dealing with new and existing threats. These conversations also revealed gaps that must urgently be addressed if reasonable progress is to be made. According to the Global Assessment Report, a study that looks at the international state of risk, the value of international development aid that went into risk prevention between 2007 and 2017 was just a paltry 4% of the entire development aid globally within the same period. Now, what that means is that the international community is much more interested or much more moved to respond to disasters as opposed to investing in risk prevention. And so if a continent like Africa, that has been so heavily reliant on international development aid, is to make progress in creating preventive mechanisms, then innovative financing solutions have to be developed now.
What we have noticed is that in addition to disaster response, funding is given for capacity building. It's very important to do the capacity building for volunteers, experts, the staff that are going to be engaged in disaster response. But more importantly is putting money into preventing disasters where we can. I think everybody believes and understands that prevention is better than cure in any given situation.
The principle of disaster risk reduction that forms the basis of these conversations is that of preparing ahead of disaster events, ensuring that in the event of an emergency, people, businesses and infrastructure are able to continue with their lives on normal functions with little or no interference, as opposed to blind budgetary allocations for emergencies that do not define what emergencies could happen or when they could happen. As has been witnessed in the past, risk financing anticipates risks, plans ahead to make people and investments safe, and creates safety nets in case of the emergency happening. This is what the African Union envisioned in creating the African risk capacity.
We do this by offering a threefold approach, I like to call it that, which is by helping countries plan helping countries provide an early warning system so as to detect the likelihood of a disaster happening. We started out with drought because that was the crisis, the disaster that was really affecting the continent the most due to our high economic level arising from agriculture. So drought, we help provide early warning in the event of drought. And then we help countries plan adequately their contingency planning so that they can build on safety net systems if they get a payout. And then the third aspect, which I just preempted, is a payout. So it's a risk transfer approach and better improving their financing systems. So it's early warning, contingency planning, and risk transfer through insurance.
Beyond protection of the mega infrastructural investments that African nations have currently embarked on, the African risk capacity makes consideration of private businesses and individuals, including rural economies that feed the continent and provide 30% of her annual wealth. The goal is to have member states embed these into their policies and legislations to ensure that no part of society is left behind as adversities become much more frequent and intense.
60% of the population in Africa live in rural areas. 30% of the GDP in average comes from the rural sector. But more importantly, 80% of the food we eat on the continent is produced locally. So you have this 60% of the people who most of them live below the $2 a day, feed us, and are totally at risk. Nobody give them insurance. Not you, not me. Okay? When disaster strikes, who suffers first? It's them. We suffer later because our food price is going to increase. Okay? In the cities if they are not touched. But they suffer. They suffer first. And this is a big part of our economy, our GDP. We have seen cases in Malawi, we calculated, in 1 year, they lost 4 points of GDP.
As different speakers and participants engaged in different sessions, one point that stood out was the need to accelerate actions as the world already lives in a climate crisis. The conference ends in Geneva, but African leaders and institutions only begin a new resolve to help the continent adjust accordingly to emerging challenges and emergencies, to strengthen internal collaborations, and to ensure the money follows the commitments. For the Africa Development Journal, I am David Owino. Drought is a familiar thing in the Horn of Africa. It is one of those things that by now we should not only be able to anticipate, but also help communities to better deal with way before it happens. That is not the case, of course. We'll still see media reports of people receiving food aid while staring at death by starvation, quite literally. Now, most people in these areas are pastoralists, and while they are usually assisted out of famine, their animals are not. And so with every cycle of drought, they lose part of their animals or part of their herds and become a little more poorer, a little more vulnerable. And so while the world discussed disaster risk reduction in Geneva, a lobby group presented animal ambassadors to raise their voice to the importance of protecting animals and other productive assets in times of disasters. Hear their voice in this next story. Livestock are important assets in Africa, helping improve the nutritional status of millions of people and contributing to economic growth. But in the age of a changed climate and diminishing resources, can these roles continue, and is there hope for rural economies fully dependent on animal rearing as a livelihood? We are standing outside the Palace of Nations, the UN offices here in Geneva, Switzerland, and a global conversation is going on across the street on reducing deaths and economic losses from disasters. But out here, inflatable animal ambassadors have been positioned to remind the world and indeed the global leaders attending the conference on the need to protect animals in times of disaster.
World Animal Protection is here to represent animal voices, and to do that we thought we would bring 6 animal ambassadors from across the world to attend the conference here in Geneva, because we believe that animals need to be part of the conversations around disaster preparedness, around policies and plans. So these inflatable animals that we've brought are in place of real animals, which we obviously couldn't bring to Geneva. And they all carry the same message from across different countries, which is that they should not be forgotten in these conversations that are taking place here in Geneva.
A 2013 study by Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN in 7 African countries shows that between 44 and 79% of rural households keep livestock. But it is important to note that within those numbers are pastoral communities that do not just keep animals, but are totally dependent on them. They are often incapable of replacing huge populations of livestock lost to cycles of drought. Animal lobby group World Animal Protection is making submissions to the global players in disaster risk reduction to make policy and program considerations that would go beyond protecting people to protecting productive assets.
1 billion of the world's poorest people rely on animals for their livelihoods. If they lose those animals, then they will immediately have a severe economic impact on their family and on the national economy of those countries. So our campaign really is to emphasize that by protecting animals, you protect humans as well.
Put practically, if the camels of the Sahel would occupy the seats in this row, and the goats of northern Kenya would occupy the next, or think about the animals of Mozambique and Malawi that were affected in the cyclones, if they could be present in this room, what is it that they could have asked of the global leadership?
animal disasters are defined in two major categories. Animal disease emergencies. Now these are diseases that affect animals and have the same impact like a natural disaster. Actually, they impact the society the way an earthquake would impact the society. And this is because if you get a big disease like foot and mouth affecting herds and herds, it destroys livelihoods, and its impact on that community and that society and that country is as if they were hit by an earthquake. The second category is what we call animal disaster emergencies. And these are animals being affected by natural disasters and even man-made disasters very much the same way people are.
Beyond interventions that will help individual communities cope with climatic and resource challenges, policy considerations suggested at the Global Platform in Geneva are a much broader look at securing a critical economic sector and ensuring food security going forward.
When there is a drought or when there is a flood, people lose their livestock. And if you remember, this is the capital. For them, it is the capital. Okay, it is their asset. Livestock is real asset. You take children to school with that. It is your reserve. It is your insurance. It is your stock. If they lose it, you will find them in the slums, in the cities, if not in the Mediterranean.
The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that beef and pork consumption in Africa will both increase 200% by 2050, while that of chicken will rise 211%. If that demand is to be met without further stretching the trade imbalance that many African nations are already grappling with, long-term approaches have to be made to address the challenges that livestock keepers are faced with, key among them weather shocks. In Kenya, the Ministry of Agriculture, with the support of Wild Animal Protection, is proposing a parliamentary bill to create the Animals in Disasters Fund under the Directorate of Veterinary Services to facilitate rapid response to animal disasters in Kenya.
This fund is for government at the national and the county level to allow the Directorate of Veterinary Services to immediately deploy within the first 24 hours to an animal emergency. Because the whole aim of an animal emergency is to rapidly identify it, contain it, and eradicate it. If you take 2-3 weeks to do that, you have lost that war.
Enactment of such law would obligate the government to take responsibility in protecting animals in disasters and define ways in which this will be achieved. The livestock sector in Africa is still mainly dependent on smallholder farmers managing their stocks traditionally, in many cases operating in difficult locations with limited resources. This kind of intervention would be important in making new knowledge, technology, and financial instruments accessible where they are most needed.
In 2006, when there was the Rift Valley fever outbreak, we lost 40 billion shillings, and that's Kenya alone, and that's only in the agricultural sector. The disease also spilled over into Tanzania. So what are we saying? When we have an animal disaster fund, and when the counties especially can respond rapidly, they can do so much more effectively, cheaper, and save us billions of shillings in early action and early response.
Having made their voices heard at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, these animal ambassadors will be heading out to different countries to be used in caravans seeking policy, education, animal disaster funding, and greater involvement of rural communities in reducing vulnerabilities of animals to disasters. Even more importantly, the organizers hope to have convinced other stakeholders at the conference to go beyond protection of people to also seek protection of animals and other productive assets in times of disasters. From the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva, Switzerland, I am David Owino, reporting for the Africa Development Journal. Now that's an interesting way to speak for animals at a global event. I find it even more interesting that they ended up speaking for people as well. Now this next story is about the private sector. 90% of all our jobs in Africa, including mine, are generated by the private sector. They are critical to our growth, of course, but they also generate risk through their investment and are exposed to risk. I spoke to government officials and business leaders at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction on the role of the private sector in disaster risk reduction. This is what they had to say. Global trade is complex, isn't it? We buy in Kenya at the click of a button products whose different parts are manufactured in many different countries. This complex web of collaboration and interdependence distributes opportunity beyond boundaries and cultures, enabling businesses to reduce costs and maximize profit. But therein also lies a risk. A cyclone in the southern Africa could cripple the global vanilla market overnight. Of course, Madagascar supplies 80% of the world's natural vanilla. A tsunami in Japan could destabilize global motor vehicle production. Not only are some of the world's most popular vehicles made there, but also chips for many other models are produced by Japanese companies. It therefore makes sense that the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva, Switzerland, had a special focus on business with sessions dedicated to the private sector.
Any discussion on disaster risk management is really a discussion about the preservation of resources, be they human, be they infrastructure, be they systems, and really just looking at how we are able to preserve the resources that we as humanity have invested in building and ensuring that we are able to enjoy the best use of them. So if you think about the role of the private sector in any economy in terms of job creation, infrastructure development, economic investment, then it's really critical that the private sector is involved because they are the holders of a lot of the resources that we have.
The private sector has been recognized as a key engine of economic development in Africa. Policies of various governments and development finance institutions have made the private sector a strategic pillar. Understandably so. A 2011 study by the German Institute for the Study of Labor, IZA, estimates that Africa's private sector employs 90% of the entire working population and received approximately 75% of all credit disbursed in the continent between 1996 and 2008. As disasters become more frequent and intense, it is clear that the losses in their wake are putting a strain on the private sector and, by extension, acting as a brake on economic and social development.
There's a great emphasis on economic development, of course, raising the standards of living and, bringing, facilities and infrastructure to people. But economic development, if not done right, becomes a long-term liability. And we're seeing that, if it's not done to a certain level of resilience, it ends up being a catastrophe, a disaster. So we have to be careful how we spend our investment money, both publicly and privately.
With a global movement to reduce human impact on the environment and preserve biodiversity by using resources more responsibly and sustainably, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction presented an opportunity for business leaders to have a broader, inclusive look at disaster risk-informed investment through the lens of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, a global blueprint for reducing deaths and economic losses from disasters. The framework sets guidelines for the private sector that, taken into account, can help significantly reduce the risk profile of investments and, in the long term, not only translate into positive risk-adjusted returns, but also positively impact society and the environment.
It was a big issue for the private sector to look at the element of profit at the expense of the environment they're working in and the risk that they're taking, depending on the type of investment that they're interested in. Managing risks is not just the job of one ministry. but it's a concerted effort of everybody, from the private sector as well as from the public sector. We're looking at communities, we're looking at everybody in society. We need to be aware, because when the disaster strikes, it's not a disaster that will strike the rich from the poor, but you may be rich and lose everything and become poor.
The participation of the private sector at the conference centered mainly on helping business leaders globally to see resilient investment not as something that restricts their ability to generate returns, but as a necessary part of what they do. Speakers identified the building and construction industry as being especially challenged in this regard.
The biggest risk I see, the biggest segment that I see that is experiencing vulnerability is residential, light commercial, and that segment of that's built by speculative developers. When I say speculative developers, I mean people who are going to resell the development in a year or 2 years, and really who are not long-term owners. So, they're building to the lowest standard, maybe building at a risky location, and if their buyer is not what I call resilient smart, and the law allows them to do that, they're not going to jail, let's say, they'll do it, and they'll make good money, and they'll keep doing it over and over and over again.
The benefits of responsible, sustainable investment are demonstrable. But at the altar of short-term gains of profit, countries have more to do than just demonstrate the gains. A deliberate process of creating the right environment to drive this trend is necessary.
We know in Kenya a large part of it that happens is when we face a disaster, call Red Cross. But Red Cross can't be all things to all men. We need to be able to have a national strategy that enables us to prepare locally, to prepare on the ground, and to be able to respond even at the lowest level, to be able to mitigate against these factors when they arise.
We need to have a give and take. Government on the one hand needs to deliver, on service delivery, and private sector on the other wants to make a profit. So we have to strike a balance. And talking to each other, looking at the laws that are in place, we encourage the investors to look at the risk element so that they don't lose their investment in totality, but we give a win-win situation on both sides.
There's sufficient scientific evidence indicating that extreme weather events will only get more frequent and more intense in the future, and businesses cannot manage to be surprised by damage and loss. After the talk in Geneva, work awaits in each country to create enterprises and supply chains that will stand foreseeable and unforeseeable adversities. For the Africa Development Journal, I am David Owino. That's right, work awaits in each country, but it ends here for us this week. Thank you so much for watching. As usual, we have a team roaming the continent, and you sure we'll have a fresh edition of the Africa Development Journal in 7 days, and stories updated regularly on our YouTube channel, Zulani TV. Please find us, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you, and stay in touch.